It is August 15th, 1977. Delaware, Ohio. A flat, unremarkable stretch of land on the campus of Ohio State University, home to one of the largest radio telescopes ever built. They called it Big Ear. Most nights, Big Ear operated in silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of listening. Its job was to scan the sky, channel by channel, frequency by frequency, searching for something no one had ever found before. That night, no one was there to hear it happen. The telescope recorded everything on long strips of computer printout paper. Numbers, columns, signals measured in intensity. Most lines looked identical. Background noise from the cosmos, the ordinary static of the universe going about its ancient business. 3 days later, a volunteer researcher named Jerry Emmons sat down at a table, coffee in hand, and began reviewing the printouts by hand, the way they always did. He was scanning column after column of numbers when he stopped. In the intensity scale used by Big Ear, most signals scored between 1 and 2. Anything above 3 was unusual. Anything above 5 was extraordinary. What Emmons was looking at scored a 30. He circled it in red pen. In the margin, he wrote a single word. Wow! That annotation, 7 letters, 1 exclamation mark, would become the most famous marginal note in the history of science. Because what Jerry Emmons had found, without knowing it, was a signal that matched every characteristic scientists had theorized an extraterrestrial transmission would produce. It had come from deep space. It had lasted exactly 72 seconds. And it was never detected again. What you are about to see is not science fiction. These are documented facts, real records, real people, real instruments. What remains unknown is the only question that has ever truly mattered. Where did it come from? To understand what happened in August 1977, you have to understand the world that built the machine that heard it. The Cold War had turned outer space into a battlefield of ideas. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a race not just for military supremacy, but for something stranger, the claim to the cosmos itself. If one side made first contact with another civilization, the propaganda value would be incalculable. But the search for extraterrestrial intelligence wasn't only political. It was deeply, stubbornly scientific. In 1960, astronomer Frank Drake had pointed a radio telescope at 2 nearby stars and listened for 200 hours. He found nothing. But his experiment, called Project Ozma, launched an idea that refused to die. That if intelligent life existed elsewhere in the universe, radio waves were the most logical way to announce its presence. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. They pass through interstellar space without significant distortion. They require relatively simple technology to generate and detect. And there was one frequency, above all others, that Drake and other scientists believed a technologically advanced civilization would choose to broadcast on. 1420 MHz. At 1420 MHz, hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, naturally emits radiation. Any civilization with knowledge of physics would know this frequency. It was, in the words of some scientists, a kind of cosmic common ground. A universal channel. In 1963, Ohio State University began building Big Ear, a telescope designed specifically to conduct the most comprehensive sky survey in the history of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It wasn't glamorous work. It was methodical, patient. Year after year, the telescope swept the sky, recording everything it heard. By 1977, the project had been running for 15 years. And in 15 years, they had found nothing worth circling in red pen. Until the night of August 15th. But to understand what that signal was, what made it so extraordinary that a scientist reached for a red pen in the middle of a routine morning, you first need to understand what it would take to fake it. Because that is precisely what every skeptic tried to do. And precisely why they failed. The signal that Jerry Emmons circled wasn't just loud. It was shaped. This is the part of the story that separates the wow signal from every other anomaly ever detected by a radio telescope. It wasn't simply a burst of noise. It had a structure, and that structure matched, almost perfectly, what physicists had spent years predicting an extraterrestrial signal would look like. Here is what the data showed. Big Ear didn't move. Instead, it was the Earth that rotated beneath the sky, carrying the telescope's fixed listening beam across different regions of space. When a signal entered that beam, it would first appear faint, then grow in intensity as the source moved to the center of the beam, then fade as it drifted out the other side. The entire process, for a point source fixed in the sky, would take approximately 72 seconds. The WOW signal lasted exactly 72 seconds. Its intensity curve, the way it rose, peaked, and fell, followed precisely the bell-shaped pattern that any source fixed among the stars would produce. It did not behave like a satellite, which would move independently of the Earth's rotation. It did not behave like a ground-based transmitter, which would remain stationary relative to the telescope. It behaved like a star, or like something beyond the stars. The frequency was 1420.4556 MHz, almost precisely the hydrogen line. The very frequency scientists had predicted. The very channel they had been listening to for years. The signal-to-noise ratio, the measure of how strong a signal is compared to the background, was approximately 30 sigma. In radio astronomy, anything above 3 sigma is considered scientifically significant. Anything above 5 is extraordinary. 30 was, by any measure, unprecedented. Historical records indicate that when Emin later described his reaction, he said he was astonished. That the signal was so strong and so clean that his first instinct was that someone had made an error. That no signal from deep space should look like that. But there was no error. The data was clean. The instruments were functioning. The calibration was correct. For 72 seconds, something, from somewhere, had been broadcasting on the one frequency humanity had agreed to listen on. And then it stopped. But here is what no one mentions in the textbooks. Big Ear had 2 separate receivers, and the signal appeared in only one of them. That single fact would fuel decades of debate. And it would point, quietly, toward something no one wanted to say out loud. Big Ear had 2 feed horns. 2 separate listening channels, positioned next to each other, scanning the same strip of sky, but with a time delay of approximately 2 minutes between them. Any signal coming from space would be detected first by one horn, then, 2 minutes later by the second horn. This was standard procedure. A built-in verification mechanism. If a signal was real, if it truly came from a fixed point in space, it would appear in both horns, 2 minutes apart, at the same intensity. The WOW signal appeared in only one. This is the detail that has never been fully resolved. Some researchers have argued that the signal was simply too brief, that it began and ended within the window of one horn scan and never reached the second. Others have suggested a technical fault in the second receiver. Others still have pointed to this asymmetry as evidence that the signal was not, in fact, from a fixed point in space, but from a source that moved, or appeared only once, or, in the most unsettling interpretation, was deliberately transmitted for exactly 72 seconds and no longer. None of these explanations fully satisfies the data. The signal came from the direction of Sagittarius, specifically from a region near the Chi Sagittarii star group, approximately 220 light-years from Earth. There are no known objects in that precise location capable of producing a natural radio emission of that intensity at that frequency. No pulsar. No quasar. No magnetar. Just empty space, or what we have always assumed is empty space. Jerry Emin himself, in later interviews, was careful. He never claimed the signal was extraterrestrial. Historical records suggest he remained genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty, from the man who first recognized it, carries its own weight. The most significant thing about the WOW signal, Emin reportedly said, is that we've never been able to explain it. Scientists would spend the next 40 years trying. And every single explanation, every theory, every model, every calculation, would eventually run into the same wall. But to understand why, You need to know what happened when they pointed every telescope they had at that patch of sky and tried to hear it again. The reaction to the wow signal was not immediate. In 1977, there was no internet, no instant scientific communication network. The printout sat in a filing cabinet. Jerry Emmons' red annotation was a private notation, not a public announcement. It wasn't until the signal was discussed in a SETI newsletter later that year that it began to attract wider attention. When it did, the response from the scientific community was methodical and serious. If the signal had come from a fixed point in space, it would still be there. All they had to do was listen. Over the following months and years, Big Ear returned to the same region of sky repeatedly. Dozens of times. Hundreds of hours of observation. Other telescopes joined the effort. The Very Large Array in New Mexico, the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, then the largest single-dish radio telescope in the world. Nothing. Not a whisper. Not an echo. Not the faintest trace of what had been recorded on that August night. This silence was, in some ways, more troubling than the signal itself. In science, a phenomenon that cannot be reproduced is a phenomenon that cannot be confirmed. The wow signal existed in a single printout, on a single night, in a single receiver. Every attempt to verify it produced nothing. And in a field that requires repeatability, that demands independent confirmation before accepting extraordinary claims, a signal you cannot hear again is a signal you cannot prove. But it is also, by the same logic, a signal you cannot disprove. Robert Dixon, the director of the Big Ear Observatory at the time, would later say that the failure to relocate the signal was deeply frustrating, but not, in his view, definitive. Radio signals from space can vary. Sources can be intermittent. And the universe, by its nature, does not repeat on demand. The wow signal remained in the database. Documented. Undeniable. And completely alone. That loneliness attracted explanations. Dozens of them. Some from serious scientists. Some from the fringes of speculation. But in the late 2010s, one researcher came forward with a theory so specific, so testable, that it briefly seemed as though the mystery was finally about to close. It wasn't. But the reason it failed tells you something important about how deep this particular mystery really goes. Over 4 decades, the wow signal attracted a remarkable number of explanations. Some were dismissed quickly. Others took years to unravel. A few remain technically unresolved to this day. Here is what science has seriously considered, and where each theory breaks down. This was the first hypothesis investigators ruled out. The signal's behavior, the way it rose and fell in intensity exactly as a fixed stellar source would, is incompatible with a moving object. Satellites and aircraft move independently of Earth's rotation. They do not produce that smooth, symmetrical bell curve in a radio telescope's beam. The data eliminates this possibility cleanly. Radio frequency interference, signals from Earth bouncing off debris or atmospheric layers and appearing to come from space, is a known problem in radio astronomy. But 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line, is a protected frequency. International regulations prohibit transmission at that frequency specifically to keep the band clear for scientific observation. No terrestrial transmitter should have been broadcasting there. No evidence of one has ever been found. In 2017, astronomer Antonio Paris published a paper arguing that 2 comets, 266P/Christensen and 335P/Gibbs, had been passing through the region of sky where the wow signal originated in August 1977. His proposal was that hydrogen clouds surrounding the comets could have produced a radio emission at 1420 MHz. It was a specific, testable, credible hypothesis. The scientific community tested it. When 266P/Christensen passed through the same region of sky in 2017, multiple observatories monitored it carefully. According to peer-reviewed responses published after Paris's paper, the signal produced by the comet was orders of magnitude weaker than the wow signal. Comets, the critics argued, do not produce radio emissions at anywhere near that intensity at that frequency. The comet hypothesis, while scientifically interesting, did not withstand scrutiny. Pulsars, rapidly rotating neutron stars, emit powerful, periodic radio signals. But they pulse regularly, like a cosmic lighthouse. The WOW signal showed no periodicity, and no known astrophysical object in that region of sky has since been identified that could produce a 30 sigma signal at 1420 MHz. This is the hypothesis no one wanted to officially endorse, and the one that no one has been able to formally eliminate. The signal matches every characteristic that scientists predicted, decades in advance, a deliberate extraterrestrial broadcast would have. The frequency, the duration, the intensity profile, the point of origin fixed against the stars. No natural explanation currently accounts for all of these features simultaneously. Some historians of science note that the very reluctance to consider this hypothesis seriously, the institutional pressure against it, may itself have slowed the investigation. To say, "we don't know," is scientifically responsible. To say, "it couldn't have been that," without evidence is something else entirely. But perhaps the most revealing thing about the WOW signal is not what the signal contained, it's what the original records show about how it was handled after Emin made his annotation. Because the paper trail that followed tells a story the textbooks rarely include. The original WOW signal printout is preserved. It is not lost, not classified, not buried in a government archive. It is a documented artifact of 20th century science, and the records surrounding it are, by the standards of their time, relatively complete. What those records reveal is a story of careful scientists operating within the limits of their tools, and of an institution that was already running out of time. Big Ear was demolished in 1997. Not because the research was complete. Not because the funding ran out in any dramatic sense. The land it occupied was sold to developers. One of the most historically significant scientific instruments ever built was dismantled to make way for a golf course expansion. The records from its final years of operation are incomplete. Some data from the 1977 to 1980 observation period was never fully analyzed. The resources simply weren't there. Jerry Emin continued to work with the SETI program for years after his discovery. According to surviving correspondence and interviews, he was a measured, methodical man, not given to speculation or sensationalism. His consistent position, documented across decades of interviews, was straightforward. The signal was real, it was extraordinary, and it remained unexplained. "I wish it would happen again," Emin said in a 2010 interview. "But I'm not sure it will." He died in 2020. The SETI Institute, the successor organization to many of the projects that grew from the Big Ear era, has continued to search. Modern instruments, the Allen Telescope Array in California, and collaborations involving some of the world's largest radio telescopes, have monitored the same region of sky thousands of times since 1977. The signal has not returned. The coordinates remain in the database. The observation windows remain open. The frequency remains protected. And the printout remains circled in red. In 2016, humanity did something unprecedented. We stopped listening, and we answered. A team of scientists and artists transmitted a response toward the region of space where the WOW signal originated. The message carried music, greetings, and the coordinates of Earth. It traveled at the speed of light. And now we enter the final, most uncomfortable chapter of the story, because the mathematics of what comes next reveal something that is either deeply humbling or deeply unsettling, depending on how you look at it. In August 2016, exactly 39 years after the WOW signal was recorded, a team led by Ernesto Zerbel and funded in part by the Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence Initiative, transmitted a deliberate response toward the region of Sagittarius where the signal had originated. The transmission carried encoded information, music from composers around the world, greetings in multiple languages, mathematical sequences, and the precise location of Earth within the solar system. It was, in the most literal sense, humanity writing back. If the source of the WOW Signal is located approximately 220 light-years from Earth, a plausible estimate, based on the signal's apparent origin near the Chi Sagittarii star group. Then the 2016 transmission will not arrive at its destination until the year 2236. Any response to that message would not reach Earth until approximately 2456. The mathematics of interstellar communication are, by their nature, humbling. The distances involved are not merely large. They are, by any human scale of experience, incomprehensible. A conversation across them takes not years, not decades, but centuries. This is the context within which the wow signal must be understood. If it was a natural phenomenon, a comet, a pulsar, some unknown astrophysical process, then it is a gap in our catalogue of the universe. Interesting but ultimately explicable. A problem awaiting a solution. If it was something else, if it was, as its characteristics suggest but cannot prove, a deliberate transmission, then the 72 seconds Big Ear recorded in August 1977 represent the only moment in human history when another intelligence may have made itself known to us. And we didn't hear it in time to respond. There is no conclusion to this story. That is not an evasion, it is the most honest thing that can be said. The signal was real. The data is preserved. The mystery is genuine. And the explanation, whatever it is, has not yet been found. What remains is the question itself. 72 seconds of something extraordinary, something that rose from silence, reached its peak, and faded back into the dark. Something that, for reasons no one has ever been able to determine, never came again.